This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
I have two talks, and I would like to give both, so I don't know how to do this. I think that I have a convenient entry point, which is the last introduction, which is to talk about engineering. I'm having some difficulties here. The only reason I show up at my own talks is to serve as a backup for PowerPoint. And it always fails me. I'm very grateful to Bill and the team here for giving me this opportunity to come here, and I apologize for not being able to make it yesterday. What I thought I would do is to keep this fairly short to give you an opportunity to raise questions, so we could actually have a discussion rather than a long lecture. So what I'll try to do is to combine essentially some of the comments I would have made yesterday, which have to do with entrepreneurship, and then link it to current global challenges associated with the transition towards sustainability. And I'll use some examples of that, and then we can get into a discussion. I have a very simple view of defining entrepreneurship, which is basically an entrepreneur. I define an entrepreneur as a person who, when asked to think outside the box, starts by destroying the box. Maybe that's a very unreasonable thing to do, but the challenges that the global community faces today cannot really be solved by accepting the status quo in terms of what we think and how we think and what we actually do. So I've been very interested in seeing the extent to which this convergence between new technological advances and new ideas promoted by people who want to make a difference happen to be the ones that get out of various economic crises. And I think at the moment what has really influenced very much the way we look at the world is the public consciousness associated with the global warming. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a phenomenon that is shaping public consciousness to a point where I believe that this is going to define the way we think about the future of technological innovation. And this is different from whether you accept whether it's man-made or not. It's just become a reality that globally there's been a sustained effort over the last two or three decades to raise awareness about ecological change that is starting to affect the way we think about the role of technology in economic transformation. In the past, we used to think of technology as the source of ecological degradation. So a large part of the debate was really organized around demonizing technologies, especially new technologies. But it has now become evident in recent years that we can't solve those problems without significant investment in scientific and technological advances. And therefore, we've come to a point where we have now come to accept the reality that solving ecological problems is going to be driven largely by investment in technological innovation. And innovation is only a part of it. It has to be linked with the transformation of those technical solutions into products and services, which is where the concept of entrepreneurship starts to play to play an important role. This has been very widely debated, so I won't spend too much time on that. And I wanted to get directly to the work that we did with the grand challenges, which is extremely interesting because when the team was put together, we were not asked or directed or instructed by the National Academy of Engineering on what to focus on. We were just basically told, look, here, there was an earlier report prepared by the Academy which laid out the previous significant engineering solutions that had had key influences on human welfare. So we had basically an open approach to exploring what the focus could be. And it's very interesting that getting all these people together from very wide diversity of backgrounds, that literally within a couple of hours of discussion, we all came to the view that the biggest challenge that faces the engineering community in the next century or so is going to be dealing with the sustainability transition, broadly defined. There's no disagreement on the committee on the fact that this is really the most important question that humanity faces. And therefore, the rest of the work of the committee got organized around ecological questions, but also complementary issues that relate to security, education, and the development of new scientific methods of discovery. But what's important as far as I'm concerned is two messages I wanted to leave you with, which kind of are positive messages. One is the rapid rate at which technology is advancing, that the rate at which scientific and technical knowledge accumulates offers the global community new opportunities to find solutions that probably previously were not accessible to us. And very often we underestimate the capacity to find technological solutions because we tend to think largely, human beings tend to think largely in linear terms. And therefore we tend to underestimate the potential impact or contribution of new technologies. If you take, for example, this cell phone as an example, the reason this is called a mobile phone is not because you can carry it in your pocket, because the first mobile phone developed by Ericsson in 1956 weighed 40 kilos. And the reason it's called a mobile was because you could put it in a car and transport it and still be able to use it. And in 1956, it was inconceivable that you could ever get this to become a popular technology. In fact, as recently as a decade ago, there were major debates on whether you could ever use cell phones in developing countries at all, or mobile phones. They were costing about $2,000. And today, this is an ubiquitous technology in most developing countries and has had a profound impact on communication, significantly transformed the way developing countries communicate, share information. And its impact has gone beyond just simple communication, has affected even political discourse in various countries. And more recently, I've been involved in a similar project working with the colleagues at MIT, which Nicolas Negroponte developed this so-called, popularly known as the $100 laptop. Costs a little more than that at the moment. But the point is, again, a similar one, that 40 years ago when Negroponte suggested that every kid in the world should have access to a laptop, it was really considered to be purely a dream. But the reason why this is possible is simply because of this rapid accumulation of scientific and technical knowledge, a lot of which becomes available in the public domain, and therefore makes it possible for us to create new combinations of devices. The only new thing here is the display. There are about 30 patents in this display. Everything else, including the flash memories, is based on publicly available technologies. And we think this will do for education what the cell phones have done for the telecommunications industry. And if you think of this as an analogy, not to mention the technical benefits of having a display that uses very small amounts of energy, this is never marketed for its ecological benefits, although there are enormous ecological benefits for devising developing devices that use low levels of quantity. I've been a big promoter of the use of LEDs, particularly in developing countries for the same reason. What I found interesting is to see especially this concept of technological leapfrogging, where developing countries, governed largely by interest to solve ecological problems, start to move into the frontiers of technological innovation in areas that we didn't really expect this to happen. Recently, I've been serving with colleagues of mine on an advisory committee of the government of Thailand on innovation, and I was given as a present this nano tie. It's made of polymers that repel water. And the reason why people in Thailand got interested in this is for obvious reasons. That if you can develop material you don't have to wash very often, that has enormous ecological benefits. And all these examples demonstrate to me the simple fact that we are facing a period where the challenge is not so much the problems that we face, but the management of opportunity, that we are confronted with enormous opportunities provided to us through technological innovation, that we need to figure out how to harness the technologies that are publicly available today, put them to use to solve ecological problems. Our report, we spent quite a bit of time discussing solar energy as an example, and here we believe that we are on the verge of breakthroughs that could transform both the way we generate power, of which solar is an example, but also the way we consume it, of which this is why I'm interested, for example, in LEDs as an example, as a technology that could be widely utilized in developing countries. And so the area of thinking about these frontiers of technological innovation, and then exploring how they could be turned into products and services, especially for global markets, which is basically the key point that was made earlier by Sue in terms of dealing with this as a global challenge. And the report didn't get into the details of how you actually do that, but one of the areas I'm particularly interested in is thinking about the role of institutions of higher learning, because much of this knowledge is generated in universities. And the mechanism that we use to get the knowledge from universities into the marketplace is essentially through incubating students. Students become the product that we deliver into the broader economy. And so I've been very interested in exploring how you create educational programs in universities that allow students to become agents of change. And this has to do with, first, how you design your curriculum. Secondly, how you teach the students. Thirdly, how you select your students. And finally, how you link universities with the business environment, particularly in terms of connection with the private sector. And these are areas, in my view, that are going to become increasingly significant in the future, because what we are noticing right now is major reforms in the way universities function to position students as agents of change. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. In Costa Rica, there's a little university that was created about 20 years ago that has designed a curriculum whose main focus is to train students to become job creators. It's an ecological university. It's one of the first sustainable development universities, where as part of the training of the students, they give loans to students to create enterprises. They create these enterprises in universities, and they run them as enterprises. And they have aligned the curriculum of the university to reflect the process of creating, running, and selling off an enterprise. So at the beginning, when the students start to work on preparing their feasibility studies, they take courses on business planning. When they set up the enterprises and start to run them, they offer them courses on business management, on production techniques. And at the end of the 18 months, this is a curriculum that takes 18 months as part of the undergraduate, 4-year undergraduate program. The students basically learn how to sell off their enterprises, how to clean up the environment, to give space for the incoming students. And the last year of the students is devoted to writing business plans so that they could go out and borrow money from banks and create their own enterprises. And at the end of the first year, we've done an evaluation of this university. At the end of the first year of the university, we find that up to 20% of the students have created their own enterprises. The majority of the others go back to work in family businesses. But the spirit here is to create a new generation of leaders who are focused on using the principles of sustainability to create new generation of enterprises that basically help not only to improve human welfare, but are guided by ecological principles. And this is possible because of the view held by Earth University in Costa Rica, that a large part of the scientific and technical knowledge that is needed to enable the students to create these enterprises is actually already publicly available. Secondly, there's a view that the pace at which we can move from research to the marketplace is getting shorter and shorter over time. And therefore, it's now possible to integrate into the curriculum of a university, which is, in this case, is a four-year program, to integrate into that program an activity that involves the creation of enterprises, and some of it is basically working with the emerging technologies. 80% of the bananas marketed by Whole Foods in the United States come from this single university. It's the only university I know of in the developing world that is actually into exporting products. And part of that revenue is plowed back into the university to support research. We're finding similar examples of experimentation in universities in even very poor countries in Africa, for example, where this vision of looking at the world as offering them an opportunity to harness existing knowledge to solve ecological problems is becoming a pervasive way by which countries are starting to think at the moment. I wanted to kind of bring this to a close, and then we can have a discussion. This has implications for governance in terms of how leaders think about the role of infrastructure and energy in development and the possibilities that exist for them to play important roles. Secondly, it has implications for how universities relate to the communities in which they are located. So my own view is that we are going to see a world which is characterized by two critical phenomena in terms of the role of universities. The first is going to be areas where universities play a bigger role in sustainability challenges in the communities where they are located. And secondly, that universities start to create international connections worldwide so that they can share their knowledge and experience with other universities around the world. So you have both a localization effort, but at the same time, globalization one. And as I mentioned earlier, this has implications on how you teach, and secondly, how you design the curriculum. And then finally, the important role that governments play in that we have this continuous debate about whether government should be involved in entrepreneurial activities directly or not. And our view in looking at various case studies where universities have played important roles in contributing to sustainability challenges, we find very important roles being played by executive officers, especially in the creation of offices of science advice at a high level in government, either to presidents or prime ministers or various ministers, to ensure that the leadership at the highest level possible is informed about technological opportunities that emerge. And this is very much driven by the fact that we have this rapid rate at which science and technology is accumulating. And therefore, leaders around the world are trying to figure out how to be informed so that they can make better choices. I think probably one of the most interesting expressions of this is a recent decision by the cabinet of Japan to create a program called Science and Technology Diplomacy. It's coordinated through the cabinet. And the reason, large part of the creation of that program was trying to figure out how to address global challenges using science and technology and ensuring that the leadership is continuously informed about what is available and what can be utilized. And if you take this, my view that we have this unique moment where the pace at which products diffuse into the marketplace is much shorter, it also means that the chances of making serious mistakes are very high. And the only way you underwrite the uncertainties associated with that process is to be more continuously informed. So you have now in the Japanese cabinet, you have people who are spending most of their time monitoring emerging technologies to ensure that when investment decisions are being made, that the government is adequately informed about the kinds of incentive systems that can be created to support those technological innovations, a lot of them in the arena of environmental conservation. We're noticing a similar trend actually in very small, poor countries. Rwanda, as an example, one of the smallest African countries that has gone through a very difficult time. The Minister for Science and Technology is embedded in the presidency, works in the office of the president. And the reason why the president has the minister working in his office is so that he can be continuously informed about emerging technologies to ensure that when they make high-level decisions, that this knowledge about technological opportunities is open to them. And finally, this is my last comment has to do with the impact of incumbency on being able to use these technologies. It's not that we don't have them. The reason why we need entrepreneurs who have to be unreasonable is that you have way too many reasonable people out there who keep saying, let's just do the same thing that we've been doing in the past. And so the challenge that faces us, all of us, is not the absence of technology, and not very often not the absence of financing, but the presence of incumbency, which is those who are committed to doing the same things that they have done in the past. When we were in the early days of working on this laptop, we were having serious debates with the incumbent producers of traditional laptops, even though we are not even trying to compete with them in the same markets. We are targeting new markets, which is elementary schools, where traditional manufacturers of laptops don't operate. But we had to have serious debates with the major companies that were producing traditional laptops. We still haven't solved those concerns yet. I was bragging not long ago at a meeting in London about the virtues of this necktie, which is some guy comes over to me and says, Professor, I don't like your necktie. And I said, why don't you like this necktie? I don't have to wash it very often. And he says, I work for Procter & Gamble. and it is may appear trivial, but the issue of how you deal with resistance to new ideas, I think is a very important part of our dialogue, especially in the area of energy and infrastructure, where we have a long-term commitment to certain practices and certain investments, that when you introduce new ideas like feeding electricity back into the grid, somebody tells you this is going to destroy or bring down the grid, don't do it. It's going to create instability in the grid. And we find similar arguments being put forward in almost every area of renewable energy technologies. And this is really the link between entrepreneurship and those who study the social implications of new technologies. That's a very important part of our work. Most of my work has been in renewable energy sources, and the pace at which they have diffused has been extremely slow. And I attribute that slow pace of diffusion of renewable energy technologies largely to the impact of incumbent practices, not because the technologies are not available or efficient, but because of opposition from incumbent forces. And that's one thing that I think we all have to work on, but also in my own work, my own teaching. I teach 2 courses. One is on how to promote new technologies, and the other one is on how to combat the resistance. Because there's no use to advocate interesting technologies when you have a large section of the population, for a variety of reasons, that is opposed to them. So thinking carefully and strategically on how to engage them as stakeholders as well, rather than getting into a direct confrontation with incumbent industries. It's almost like the politics of technological innovation. I wanted to stop there and give you a chance. I know you have ideas and thoughts, and I wanted to turn this into a discussion rather than a lecture. I have 2 PowerPoint presentations. They will be available on the website if you wanted to go and have a look at them. So thank you for your attention.
You just talked about is this on? Okay, you just talked about the benefits of experimenting in developing areas or places where the incumbency doesn't exist. And the World Bank released a report earlier this year in which they expressed really grave concern about the absorptive capacity, as they call it, for these areas to absorb technologies maybe from places like the US or Europe. Is that a problem in your mind? Do you agree with the World Bank that that's really a major problem that's preventing progress?
Yeah, I agree with that as a major concern, and the absorptive capacity of developing countries can be classified in 3 categories. The first is at the level of individuals. And here, training in the engineering sciences becomes extremely important. So you go to many of the developing countries, you find that their level of training in the engineering sciences is extremely low. So that reduces the ability to absorb existing technologies, because you need to understand how these technologies work. Now, in the olden days, you can look at a bicycle and you can figure out how different components interact with each other. It's very hard to do that by simply looking at a microprocessor. So you need more expertise in being able to understand how it works. The World Bank hasn't been very helpful in the past in promoting training, especially in the universities in developing countries. In fact, in the early years, the World Bank advocated quite aggressively the view that investment in universities did not have a direct impact on economic development. So I'm glad, and I have a lot of colleagues I work with there who are trying to change this view of the bank. I work more closely with the African Development Bank, which has a more progressive view on this topic. So the first level is the human competence. This is where training in the engineering sciences comes in. The second, in terms of absorptive capabilities, has to do with enterprises, especially technology-based enterprises. This is at the institutional level. And the third level has to do with the societal capabilities, which is the laws and incentives in society that encourage countries or enterprises to absorb new technologies through joint ventures, tax rebates, and all that. So you need to think of it in those 3 levels. The part that bothers me most in most developing countries is the traditional separation between research and teaching in universities, where the research is many developing countries, both in Africa and Latin America as well. The research is carried out in national research institutes where they do research, but they don't teach. So they have a lot of knowledge, but it doesn't diffuse into the economy, because the best mechanism for diffusing knowledge into the economy from universities or from research institutes is called commencement, where you send these young people out of the universities. There's no commencement in national research institutes. In fact, what you have is almost they stay there until they retire. Then you have universities where by law or by design they teach, but they don't do a lot of research. So effectively, over time, the quality of their teaching will degrade because they're not doing research. So I've been an advocate of bringing both research and training. This is actually self-evident in the United States because that's how most universities here function. Is the research, teaching, and extension are combined. The land grant model, whether it's in agriculture or in industry, is an accepted part of the functioning of universities here, complete with incentives that allow faculty to actually do research. You'll be surprised that in most developing countries, this is not the case. There's that separation. And that limits the ability to absorb new knowledge, turn them into goods and services, and then diffuse them into the economy. And so we need a new generation of universities. I've been championing that recently, working with the African presidents. I ran a panel, an advisory panel commissioned by African presidents recently on life sciences research, on biotechnology, which produced a report called Freedom to Innovate. And the most important recommendation we make in that report is to combine research, teaching, and connection with the private sector in the same universities. But that will be a different university model. And there's a lot of resistance to that model by conventional universities. I'll give you, again, a good example of this. In the country of Malawi, the president thought that the best way to upgrade the performance of the small and medium-sized enterprises in the capital city of Lilongwe was to create a science and technology university that would link up with the small producers and help them to improve their technical efficiency. And he was informed that the Ministry of Science and Technology didn't think that this was the job of the university. This needed to be done by a National Research Institute. So he abolished the Ministry of Science and Technology and created a Department of Science and Technology and put it in the presidency. And then later on, he was informed that if it was a university, now this was the Minister of Education informing him that, Mr. President, if it's a university, it has to teach like other universities. It can't be engaged in this practical work. Otherwise, it will be a vocational school. And the president was a little surprised by that, so he took over the Ministry of Science and Technology. He's now the Minister of Science and Technology and Education. And his argument was that if it's different, then it's contradictory, therefore it's not needed. And if it's the same, therefore it's duplicating, therefore it's needed. So his view was that you couldn't actually achieve anything under those circumstances. Again, another case of incumbency of existing practices standing in the way of something that's fairly straightforward. So I agree with the World Bank view, and I would like to encourage them to actually think more creatively about support to a new generation of universities, not just upgrading or reviving old universities that where they don't do research. And it's not a function of money, by the way. It's an incentive. The incentives provided to the universities and how the laws governing the role of universities are actually defined. Pakistan has had a significant increase in funding available to the universities. And the concern there is that the professors spend most of their time teaching. So just giving them more money to do research is not going to help because they don't have the time to actually do the research. So you need to change the incentive structure so that there's time for research and there is connectivity between the research and the private sector. Yes, please.
It may be implicit in what you've been saying, but I think the overriding factor in all of this is economics. And if it is economically feasible, then ideas get advanced. If they aren't, they fall by the wayside. The technology can be excellent, but if it can't compete on an economic basis, then it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And there's a lot of good ideas. The other thing is need. If there isn't a need, or if the need is satisfied to a certain extent, it's very hard to change what you're referring to as the incumbency. So, I mean, these are very critical problems, and I think that there has to be more awareness of the economics of all of these issues, because that's really what makes things work or not work.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that, the economics. But you can also improve the economics by improving the environment under which the creativity takes place. I'll give you a small example of this. I was visiting my country of Kenya recently, and I met a gentleman who has worked with a group of researchers from the University of Nairobi to develop a wind turbine that can generate power at a speed of about 2 meters per second. This is extremely low levels of low speeds. And this became necessary because every time Kenya imported wind turbines from Denmark, Germany, and other countries, they didn't work because they were designed to operate at high wind speeds. And he has manufactured and sold about 80 units distributed across the country. But each time he gets an order, he has to make this kind of an one-off turbine. So he's just looking for small amounts of money, which is $5 million, to actually develop a manufacturing plant to meet orders. And he was getting orders not just from Kenya, but from as far away as Nigeria. And the limiting factor here wasn't the absence of money, but the absence of the institution of venture capital. This is what he had actually been looking for. And we worked with students of mine to review the Kenyan legislation, and we found out that the capital markets are structured in such a way that he wouldn't get this kind of support because of the absence of this institution of venture capital. So I think that the environment, the policy environment, can actually be improved to enable players like that to actually start manufacturing and have an impact on the economy. This is independent of the fact that he was worried about being able to feed back electricity into the grid, which is a different issue, because that's why he was hearing about the fact that if he fed back electricity into the grid, it could destroy the grid. But his biggest challenge was actually the incentives that would enable people to fund him to manufacture that. I also found another example of that with a small company that is producing tissue culture plantlets for distribution. Is distributed within Kenya, but they could have practically a regional market. So I think that the economic reality can be improved through various incentives. Many of these developing countries are not doing themselves a favor by not integrating and creating larger markets, where you have these small countries that are little enclaves, and therefore they don't have large enough markets to attract important financial players, but also to encourage governments to create standards, common standards, that allow goods to move more freely between the countries. So I totally agree with you, and I think that can be improved. The good news is that there's a lot of effort that is going into thinking through how you improve the policy environment to accommodate the development of technology-based enterprises. Mostly actually triggered by the experience of the cell phone. Particularly among African leaders, they ask very practical questions where they use the cell phone as an analogy because of the impact it has had on African economies. They ask, like, what's the equivalent of the cell phone in energy or in transportation or in agriculture? And again, I think they're thinking that way because they are guided by these economic benefits that they have seen accrue from a technology they never thought would have any role to play in poor countries. Yes.
I was hoping you could spend just a few moments discussing some of the challenges that we faced in engineering better medicines, touching both on the research and the development, but then also on the business end and the challenges of new disruptive technologies competing with the sustaining advancements that we have today.
Yeah. This is an issue that we dealt with on the grand challenges. One was just the area of drug discovery and thinking through how you develop new drugs. And this is where the incumbency questions start also to play a role. There's a large debate, significant debate around stem cell research. And I'm working with a colleague from Thailand at the moment who's been looking at stem cell research. And you start to think about the long-term implications of stem cell research in terms of being able to reduce the cost of health care, but you have to deal in the early stages with the arguments that are guided by moral considerations. And so the way to go around that has been, in fact, to invest in further scientific and technological research to find alternative ways of obtaining stem cells without having to confront the ethical and moral arguments directly. And the way you deal with that essentially is to diversify your R&D activities. And you can do that within countries, but also across countries. One of the recommendations we make in this report that we prepared for African presidents, because the area of health is extremely important, is to encourage them to enter into international partnerships as far as research is concerned. The second part of the second challenge has been when it comes to the politics of conducting clinical trials, where I work quite a bit with colleagues in the Gates Foundation that have invested large amounts of money in research and development, particularly in the area of vaccines. And they face enormous challenges in conducting clinical trials in countries that might actually benefit from those vaccines. And there, one of the observations that we make in this report, but also in other studies, is the importance of engaging developing country scientists in the early phases of research and development, especially if you're going to develop products of relevance to the tropics, to engage the scientists in those countries early enough so that they see themselves as stakeholders. Because if they don't, they start to see this as potential. They start to see the African countries or developing countries as so-called guinea pigs. But this is, again, a convenient argument used simply because they have not been part of the research. This is a very important point to take into consideration, which is that if you have those early partnerships in research being established, then developing country scientists become the ones who champion for approval for clinical trials in their country, so that you don't have to take the responsibility to promote them, because they see themselves as partners in the process. So they become genuine stakeholders. And I'm currently working with colleagues of mine who are based in Japan, 2 ambassadors, African ambassadors, to collaborate with Japan in establishing a pharmaceutical university in Africa. This is something that's missing on the continent. Therefore, any of you who have an interest in developing products of relevance to African countries will not have the opportunity to partner with anybody because of the absence of infrastructure for research in the pharmaceutical area. So this is something that I'm currently actively encouraging, and we probably will start to see more investment among African countries themselves setting up research facilities. I've just been working with a colleague of mine who is the current Minister of Health Services in Kenya to create an institute funded by the National Health Insurance System in Kenya to conduct research, particularly in the bioengineering sector. This is the place where you could do research on emerging diagnostics for tropical diseases, but also to move into drug discovery, especially taking advantage of nanotech, that with the nanotechnology we now have possibilities to test a lot of new materials against old diseases and see what is actually possible. What's positive here is the dramatic interest on the part of the African countries now, despite their limited financial resources, to actually put money into building scientific institutions. And so I think the key element there is going to be thinking about partnerships between them. When it comes to manufacturing, I think that's something that I would argue that that might be better left to companies that have expertise in manufacturing and marketing. But in these early phases of research and development, as well as clinical trials, that if you build early partnerships, that will increase your chances of actually getting local stakeholders. This is a very important area. I think that for in the near future we're going to see a lot more interest on the part of developing countries to engage, both in the context of research, but some interest in manufacturing. Here I have a minority view when it comes to manufacturing, where I believe that this is better done by those who already have the installed infrastructure, both for manufacturing and marketing. Yes, please.
As you reflect on your own experience in dealing with companies either directly or indirectly, what do you think is the most important element? I'll break it down into the idea, the invention, or the technology, or the second group, the successful commercialization of the technology, idea, or product or service?
Can you reframe the question so I don't miss the essence of it?
Well, an entrepreneur will start a company, and for it to be successful down the road, when you look back, what was the most important ingredient to making the company successful? Was it the idea of the invention, whether it be a product or an idea or a service, or was it the successful implementation, commercialization, I call it, of the management team, money, financing, luck, time, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, I would say the last part, because I would demonstrate this with an example, which is the Chile Foundation in Chile, which was created in the 70s after the Allende debacle there. And the big problem was how to diversify the economy. There was a debate in Chile on whether to put money in developing new products or whether to conduct a global search for existing products and ideas, bring them into Chile, and then develop the new products and commercialize them. And they chose the latter route of saying, let's build up the capacity to identify existing ideas, create businesses around them, and then sell off those businesses. So they didn't do the initial R&D. They spent most of their time on the concept of search. And this is guided by the view that there was already a lot of ideas out there worldwide that could be brought into Chile and used to create new enterprises. So my view, particularly thinking about the developing countries, that the first step is the search process. And that search process, to me, is consistent with the earlier point about entrepreneurship, because that's what entrepreneurs do, is to identify, assess the opportunities, and then exploit them. Because the knowledge is continuously being generated. And the area that we've just been discussing, the area of pharmaceutical research, you find a lot of ideas of relevance for the developing countries that have not been utilized, because this latter part, which is the execution part, is still very weak. There's a corollary to that, in that you will find in developing countries themselves. I take my own city of Nairobi, where there's something like $50 million spent in the city of Nairobi annually on life science research. And you go into the labs, you'll find a lot of prototypes, mostly in the area of diagnostics for human, animal, and crop diseases. Very few of them have been commercialized, because this latter part of the work, which is the entrepreneurial part, hasn't been adequately developed. So my argument is that that's where you start. And after you've exhausted that pool of knowledge that's available, then you also have earned enough revenue from using that first generation of knowledge that you can plow into new research and development. But the first part is really this entrepreneurial effort.
The reason I bring this up is that our company is merging another company into our company. And the technology that we're acquiring is going to be commercialized by the management team that's in place. So the discussion had to be, what is it worth? What is the technology worth in the merger of two companies together? The answer finally became both were important, both were equal, and they had to come in as equal partners. It was an interesting experience.
Yeah. I think in a case like that, you need you need both, in where you have the acquisition, a company gets acquired by another one because you have complementary assets in terms of marketing and technology. Because if the assets were not complementary, then there will be no basis for entering into.
And don't forget money.
Yes, money is essential in this case. Yeah, yeah. I don't see anybody. Oh yes.
Okay, I have a question about. Is it on? Okay, I have a question about emerging technologies that we were talking about, and how one of the other people asked a question about economics really determines a lot of the outcome, whether something's going to be profitable or not. A lot of these technologies, like that low-cost notebook, may not be profitable at first, but they have a lot of long-term benefits. So how do we force like companies, governments, to think more long-term and invest in technologies like creating a low-cost notebook, knowing that that's going to help people in Africa become more knowledgeable with computers and contribute later on? So how do you give incentives for that long-term kind of viewpoint?
Yeah, this is a very important part of the discussion, which is how you develop a long-term vision that creates a space. This is the temporal dimension of technological innovation. That long enough for them, if you take, say, the digital readers, I think Sony has come out with the third version of their digital reader, and the reason they are doing it for the third time is because they have been around that long. But you can imagine so many other smaller venture companies that could have basically gone out of business and lost the know-how. This is where I start to think more about how you structure your financing arrangements, but also what kinds of players you bring along to participate in technology development. I just mentioned the case that I'm involved in Kenya. We've been having a discussion on who should be the best institution to fund the creation of a biomedical research center. And we opted for the National Health Insurance Fund because of its longevity. Because it can take those kinds of risks. It has accumulated capital, and it can afford to. It's diversified enough and has a vested interest in that field, and can support the creation of that kind of institution, as opposed to, say, the Ministry of Health that is dependent on annual allocation of budgets, and therefore Parliament can cut off a program in the middle of research. So thinking of enterprises or both public and private corporations that have that longevity that can absorb the early costs. In the early days, not long ago, I was thinking about LEDs, how to get LEDs distributed in Africa, and I was thinking of what kind of enterprises would have that long-term vision in Africa to be able to disseminate the use of LEDs. And we brought this idea up with Coca-Cola. Because it will be beneficial for Coke to use LEDs for its billboards. But if they can be installed in places where kids can use them as a source of light, they already have a benefit, because there's a marketing element for them, because they do billboards anyway. So it's kind of a corporate equivalent of public procurement. In this case, it will be private procurement with the public interest. And we thought that if you have a large corporation like Coke getting engaged, that will help to drive down the price of LEDs, where they could then become affordable by developing countries. So there isn't a single solution, but the point here is to think of entities, whether they are public or private entities, that have got long-term viability, that they can take some risks, and therefore be able to support the development of a new technology long enough for that technology to have, at least to be tested in the marketplace. I've looked at other examples, particularly in how the Koreans have done this in the past, is to encourage enterprises to create research-based universities, because they had faith in the longevity of certain enterprises. In the late 80s, the government worked closely with the Pohang steel mill in Korea to create the Pohang University of Science and Technology, which is considered to be one of the best science and technology institutions in Asia. But the reason why it was incubated, the choice of incubating it to work on technologies that were considered to have long-term possibilities, was because of the viability of a steel mill, that this is an enterprise that was likely to be around for a long time, given what it did. So I've been looking into this, for example, working with the telecom companies to see the extent to which telecom companies can actually help to incubate new research institutes. And those research institutes don't have to work on telecoms alone. In fact, Pohang Steel Mill, which incubated Pohang University of Science and Technology, the university does not work on steel. It's one of the best genetic engineering and biotech universities in Asia. It actually diversified, but there was that security and continuity provided in its funding to the university, so that the university could then undertake these long-term research programs. A group of telecom companies in Egypt have pulled together their resources, working with the government, and created what's called the Nile University. It's the first university in Africa incubated by the telecoms industry. And it's not accidental that they're working with the telecoms industry, because of the view that this is an enterprise that is likely to be around, or a sector that's likely to be around for a long time. But this is a very, very important question, because the character of institutional arrangements that you create will affect whether you can really sustain programs that require support over the long term. I think here in the US, we've been very successful in doing it through, for example, military budgets. Again, not only are they long term, but some of them are insulated from public debate. Other countries like Singapore have tagged some of these projects onto infrastructure, long-term infrastructure investment projects. So there are a lot of ideas you could explore, which depend very much on the nature of the technology, but also the country that you're operating in.
Alessis Juma, JFK School of Government, Harvard University, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your visit.